Hi, everyone. My name is Isaias Hernandez, and it's so nice to meet everyone. Today at Loop, we're introducing our circular conversations chats that's basically looking at the plastic-free July. And so we're here today to really showcase circular conversations throughout the week. Today's panel will be focusing on individual people doing environmental work that will really look into the plastic issue waste. And so I'm here to really talk about Plastic Free July briefly. So for those who may not be experienced, is that Plastic Free July is a global movement and that happens in July that encourages individuals to reduce their plastic waste, whether it be through a week, a day, or a month. Plastic Free July really raises awareness for individual action and to really take initiative for that. And so with that being said, I would love to introduce each of our panelists today that have come through a variety of locations throughout the world. So would love to first introduce Kristy.
Hi everyone, my name is Kristy Drutman and I am the host and creator of Brown Girl Green, which is a podcast and media series where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about diversity and inclusion and creative solutions to the climate crisis. And I'm really excited to be here today and to join Loop to talk about Plastic Free July and to continue this conversation around the world.
Thank you, Kristy. And today, and the next panelist we'll be introducing is Mackenna.
Hi everyone, I'm Mackenna. I'm an environmental advocate based on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. I'm also the lead coordinator for monthly beach cleanups around the island, and I'm an artivist, which combines activism, bringing attention to important issues, and combining it with artwork to spread awareness for an important cause. And I'm excited to join this conversation and help further the conversation.
Thank you so much again. And last but not least, we'll introduce Isaac.
Hi, everyone. I'm with Pollinator Partnership. I've been here for about 4 years now, and we're a nonprofit organization that deals with pollinators and all pollinator issues. We're the largest organization devoted exclusively to the protection of pollinators, and they're obviously very foundational for a lot of other planetary issues and ecosystem issues.
Thank you for that. And so I guess to start off our series of what, as individuals ourselves can really make change within the plastic crisis that we face today, I would love to first know a little bit more information about everyone. So how did your either sustainability or / environmental journey start? And what really, was there a specific memory that really sparked your interest into learning more about the environment?
I can start. So I would say that the thing that really pulled me into caring about climate change was realizing how it impacts people in the Philippines. So my family's from the Philippines. I'm Filipino. And I learned about Typhoon Yolanda when I was in college. And I realized that climate change isn't just this distant thing that's untouchable. It's actually impacting communities and families like mine on the ground. And so I realized that I needed to step up and take responsibility to address the environmental crises of our time. And I think especially now with, plastic waste and the impacts that it's having specifically on Southeast Asia, I feel very invested in talking about the sustainability around our waste.
Thank you for that. I'll have Mackenna.
For me, I don't think there was any particular moment specifically, but honestly, growing up here in Hawaii, obviously the scenery is incredible, and so that connection to nature 1000% helped jumpstart me to caring for the ocean and for the planet as a whole. But then also even just as someone who's not Native Hawaiian myself, but growing up here, being immersed in the culture, to Malama the Aina, to take care of the land, that's very much a part of the core values here. And I think those two things combined really sparked my interest and my love for the planet and nature and wanting to take care of the very things that I love. And then going diving, being around this beautiful island and seeing the contrast of, plastic pollution in comparison to the environment, it was a rough wake-up call and definitely helped jumpstart my awakening.
Yeah, thank you so much again for sharing that. We'll have Isaac.
Yeah, similarly, I don't think that there is one specific instant. Maybe I've just always really enjoyed nature and being out in the environment. Mm-hmm. And I've just had a love for biology ever since I was very young.
Yeah, and I think that all of us, collectively agree, and even those watching can also agree that we have some affinity and love for nature, obviously. And so I think that, during these times, especially with COVID-19, I would love to ask everyone, like, how has it changed or shaped your relationship with plastic? As you may know, Plastic-free July, usually people think that they have to reduce all their plastic usage, and especially since a lot of companies and organizations have banned single-use reusable products to go into your grocery stores. And so I just was wondering what that really means to you, each and every one of you.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, COVID-19 is such a bizarre time, and definitely some unusual circumstances. For me in my life, specifically here in Hawaii, it's definitely interesting. Literally just late last year in December, Hawaii finally passed a legislative bill that will phase out single-use plastic items. And that's still in plan, but to just a few months later have it almost go back to relying on single-use plastic in many ways and limiting reusable items, it's definitely been discouraging to kind of feel like we've taken a step back. Even, obviously it is a very unusual time, but it's definitely been bizarre and weird. And I know that a lot of people here, because the environmental interest is so strong and is so important to the people here, it's definitely taking a toll on a lot of us, especially since we see plastic washing up all the time on our beaches. And so us not being as able to help limit that has been definitely difficult in many ways.
Yeah, I guess building off of that, I feel exactly the same. I feel like it's felt really discouraging because, we want to be safe. We want to prioritize people's health and safety first and foremost. And I think there are those times where we have to make those compromises. But the thing is that we have to realize that we're in this very particular moment where that should be the exception, not the rule. And I feel like, leading up to, before this moment, people were conveniently using plastic here and there because it's addressing the source of how that plastic's produced. That's the issue. And so I think if anything, this moment is really sad and scary when it comes to thinking about the amount of plastic and packaging that's being accumulated. But it's also a chance for people to take a step back, think about ways that they can actually reduce their plastic and also, cook meals at home, be able to reduce the amount of things they're buying and actually figuring out how to make or DIY things. So I think that that's really useful and important to do.
Yeah, and I think in particular, kind of what Plastic-Free July means for me is just a good reminder that plastic is still an issue, even though we're dealing with a pandemic and lots of other things right now. And I think especially in the medical industry, plastic is really essential for a lot of the things they're doing. And so it's a reminder just how ingrained plastic is in our society and in the things we do, and that there is a need for technological improvements.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everyone here saying that. And I think that, it has definitely reshaped a lot of our relationships. And during this time that we usually, those that are able to stay at home, is really finding innovative ways and really reflect during that time about our own plastic usage. And so I kind of want to shift towards, some general facts about plastic, of course, is that according to the United Nations, around 300 million tons of plastic are produced every year. And so essentially, what has happened is that a lot of us have obviously relied on plastic. And so the United Nations found out in a report is that only 9% of plastics are heavily recycled. And so I guess what are some of the reasons why you think as individuals ourselves we're so heavily relied on in this society?
Yeah, so this is for everyone, I assume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I was distracted by the screen change there. Yeah, I think one reason they're so relied on is just that it's easy, that it's there and that it's cheap and that it's available. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say, like, again, it's like talking about like who's producing these products in the first place. Like, why, these companies know that like this is like the baseline of that, people grow up thinking that, these products are very durable, they can last a long time, and it's just embedded in our culture. And so it's one of those things where companies are like, well, no one's going to like call us out on this, so we're going to keep producing more plastic, because that's just kind of the norm, or it's become the norm, at least in the past like century or so. And so I don't know, until people come up with other alternatives on, changing packaging at the source, it's really difficult to change that systemically.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Kristy, it's a lot of it, I think, is the durability and the longevity that makes plastic so appealing. Yes, for consumers, but I mean, companies who are producing it, and it's, more affordable than other alternatives that are perhaps more sustainable at the moment. And I think that itself is very attractive, I think, in the kind of throwaway culture, go, 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 hustle, like that kind of thing, towards anything cheap. And that's, I don't really need, I'll just toss it away. Don't think about it ever again. And I think that's something that a lot of, companies, corporations recognized and marketed to consumers as people. And then obviously now we've kind of developed almost this need to use it for everything. And it's like very difficult to escape plastic pollution. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of just doing what we can, obviously, but it is a bigger picture looking at the system itself and hitting the problem at the source as well.
Yeah, definitely agree on that. I think that redesigning our own relationships with plastic and how we see it too in our own lives and how that's incorporated, but also looking at larger pictures of like how they're being produced and like how that's obviously leading to the increase of the environmental degradation for our oceans and lands. And so I kind of want to give this question to Isaac, essentially. So obviously the plastic crisis is a global environmental issue that's happening throughout the world. Have you seen any direct correlation between certain countries that have lost the most pollinator populations? And do you feel that as if the plastic crisis has exacerbated or contributed towards the decline of these populations?
Yeah, so I guess a short answer to part of that is that we don't really have great data to just look at pollinator populations from all over the world and be able to say, okay, in this country or in this region, there's more decline than in other areas. And I think a lot of that has to do with the amount of data that we have. Also just the fact that pollinator decline is such a multifaceted issue. So even in a country where plastic is being produced and disposed of much more frequently than here, I don't know that we could say that decline is directly linked to the plastic. But what I will say is that plastic is part of the problem, definitely, that pollinators are facing. And it's not really as linear or as straightforward maybe as what we see sea turtles going through or some other organisms. And I think really the main impact that plastic has on pollinators is in its contribution to climate change, essentially. I mean, looking at the production of plastic, produces incineration, I should say, roughly like 6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the production of plastic uses, like, I've heard anywhere from like 5 to 10% of global oil supply, which is just huge. And climate change really does affect a lot of pollinators, which are very dependent on micro ecosystems. And this is especially evident, I think, in alpine areas, which are more fragile ecosystems to begin with. But we're seeing certain bee species literally moving up in elevation that they occupy. Yeah, so definitely it is having an effect, but maybe not as direct as you might suspect.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that a lot of course, like you mentioned, a lot of factors go into these, the decline of populations, of course, especially with climate change. And so I guess like with Kristy, I know that you mentioned that you had did some work in the Philippines. And so you had briefly, we had talked about like, you know, the plastic crisis being in the Philippines. And so from a land perspective, I guess, you know, can you kind of touch brief on that issue within the land? Because I think a lot of the times it's sometimes focused within coastal communities. And so I think we also need to acknowledge too that it's within the land.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of layers there, but I mean, the biggest thing that I hope people who watch this know is that, like, if you think recycling your plastic is doing a great thing for the earth, like, it kind of is, but have you ever wondered where that plastic goes to? It gets shipped to countries like the Philippines. And, you know, there's a report that just got released, I think about a week ago or so, reporting that the EU, like, yeah, it's reported that most of their recycled plastic waste is going to Southeast Asia. And so it's really on my heart and mind on, like, yeah, how, yeah, our waste has to go somewhere. And mostly it's like, you know, brown, Black, and Indigenous communities that are going to have to, you know, be impacted the most by that. And whether that's like incinerating trash, whether that's just like being swamped with plastic waste in landfills, all of these things are impacting marginalized communities first and foremost. And so I think when I'm thinking about the land and I'm thinking about plastic waste, I'm thinking about, you know, the jobs that are created from sorting through, you know, waste management in you know, countries in the global south, but also like, what are the toxins they're being exposed to when those things are getting processed? What is their say and their right to, if that waste is allowed to be imported into their countries? And like, where's, you know, the global decision on why that waste ends up there in the first place? And so those are the things that are really on my mind, especially someone who like has lived and worked in the Philippines, is just seeing that, you know, there's so much talk about, you know, wanting economic development in these countries. But at the same time, you're also dumping a bunch of waste there. So what are you really trying to accomplish? So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a huge concern, and also the lack of available data that it's available for people to access. And so, Mackenna, from your perspective, obviously living near a coastal community and yourself seeing the issue of plastic change over your time living there, can you briefly like talk about like how it's impacted your own community?
Like where to even begin, honestly. I mean, for one, I'm like an amateur freediver and I just love the ocean. And so being immersed in it, I cannot remember the last time I didn't find at least one trace of plastic pollution, whether that's fishing line on, you know, coral reefs, whether that's plastic bags. We have a ton of plastic packaging, chip bags, candy wrappers, that kind of stuff, bottle caps, like literally anything. It's pretty common for my friends and I to go diving, not necessarily intending to do a reef cleanup, but we end up doing a reef cleanup. And it's definitely a challenging thing to grasp. But, you know, when you're in that beautiful environment and you see something that's tainting it, like the least you can do, like you can't not want to go and help in that small way. And so definitely some extra motivation for sure, but the jarring contrast is very difficult. But then on the beaches, for example, especially on all over the islands, but especially on the Northeast, plastic washes in a pretty dense amount. Hawaii residents, and especially more like the tourism industry, like, yeah, we do use a lot of plastic ourselves, but a lot of what's washing up on the beaches is from offshore. On that side of the island specifically, it's believed that a lot of it actually is distributed from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And for those who might not know what that is, it's pretty much like a huge plastic. It's not an island. People will refer it to as an island. It's just like a huge like cloud of plastic pollution from all over the world, like northeast of Hawaii. And so we hit a lot of that stuff coming in on that side onto our beaches. And it's very, very common. I do cleanups again monthly, but also just on my own time with friends. And get pieces of plastic, and you can see like fish bite mark or that kind of stuff. Definitely interesting. And then there's a ton of microplastic, just tiny pieces that wash up on the shoreline. It's definitely difficult because it's so small that a lot of people, the average person, especially like people who are visiting, they just don't notice the problem at all. It goes unnoticed. But it's also equally horrible for the planet, horrible for animals, and obviously all that connected to people. And it's so difficult to pick up. It's impossible to collect all of it. It keeps coming in. It's so tedious, and just it's never ending. And living here, growing up here, even as my awareness has only been heightened within the past, I don't know, several years at the most, I've seen so much change and escalation in plastic pollution ending up around our waters and in our ecosystems. And it's truly a brutal wake-up call, but an important one, since the more people who can see that it's an issue, the more people I would hope would get involved.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, I guess a question for the audience: have you observed the single-use plastic crisis? So I think that all of us collectively agree that, wherever we may be, we have seen the issue, whether it be in urbanized areas or coastal communities or rural areas, they all have impacts of the plastic crisis. And so I kind of wanted to shift a little bit towards how everything's being interconnected, especially with pollinator populations. And so, Isaac, you mentioned that on the website for your organization, it talks about, pollinators bring around $20 billion worth of products annually, right? And so most of those products are assuming to go towards, obviously, food products. And so a lot of the packaging is all plastic wrapped. And so do you feel that, with the decline of population for pollinators, do you see a decline for the demand of plastic being used?
So short answer, I guess, for that would be we don't really have a metric for that. I don't think anyone's actually studied that. But yeah, I'm going to assume that it seems like you're talking about maybe a more massive decline. Like,
yeah,
we're thinking into the future here on this question.
Yes.
And I would hope that we would see a decline in demand for plastic before it gets to that point where we're starting to worry about food security and things like that. Yeah, I would hope that we get there before we see a massive decline in populations and a bunch of other environmental issues. The logic does seem to follow that if there's a decline in pollinator population, there's going to be a decline in demand if we don't have the things to package.
Yep.
But it's really difficult to say how that would actually happen because we don't know really how that would play out. Without pollinators, we would definitely lose much of our agriculture and also many of our ecosystem services. Like, we think about carbon sequestration, resources for wildlife in general, a lot of our hiking trails, water filtration, erosion control. A lot of things are really dependent on pollinators here. And some of the most widely used crops, like in America here, we think about wheat or maybe corn and just large monocultures, aren't actually pollinated by animal pollinators. So you could say, well, we may just replace pollinated agriculture with non-pollinated agriculture, in which case I'm not really sure that it would affect the demand for plastic. And of course, if we get to the point where we're talking about losing agriculture, the demand would likely decrease as more people start actually taking stuff seriously. I don't think people want to lose watermelons and strawberries and all their fruits and tree nuts. I would suspect that we might get more strict legislation or just people changing habits before we get to that point.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate you adding that social value, not just the economic value, of course, that pollinators bring in, because sometimes obviously we think about capital growth and how much products are bringing into this industry, and so I think that's really important about that. And so I guess for Kristy, I guess what are some common misconceptions that you have seen people about reducing their plastic usage, and just how do you combat that, especially in being in the environmental community?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really big misconception is that you won't be able to live without some single-use items. It does require a mindset shift. I was very skeptical about like zero waste shampoo and conditioner bars, for instance. Like, I have really thick hair, and I was like, I don't think these are made for me. And at first I was like super skeptical, but then I used it a few times and I was like, you know what? This is just about shifting how you use items, and it's like rethinking how you do things, and slowing down, which is like it's basically a counterculture to how our society works right now. Is like reducing your waste is counterculture to like the status quo. It literally requires you to hold yourself accountable and to try to do better. And I think that people think it's like, oh, it has to be this really expensive, inaccessible thing, and in some ways it is, and it can be, because you know, having to cook and prepare all your own meals, like there's a lot of things you need to have access to be able to do that. But I think the biggest thing is just when shifting your habits, it's about pre-planning. So it's about like, okay, how is this one item or product that I'm gonna like make like DIY zero waste something, for instance, like if you want to just like make your own paste for something, or you want to make your own household cleaner out of old fruits and vegetables, etc. So that way you're not going out and having to buy another like plastic bottle. I mean, that means you're going to have to like think it mentally in your head. How am I going to like use all these items strategically to make them last longer so I don't have to buy another single use item? So it takes a lot more like thinking and planning and strategizing, which I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but that's like, in my opinion, how you actually do it. It's not just like, let me just buy this reusable water bottle. It's like, let me actually rethink how I'm living my life to actually live counter to this convenience culture. And maybe you don't want to let go of some things, and maybe you're willing to let go of other things. And it's about actually creating a budget for that and being able to actually figure out how much am I willing to spend to find alternatives, how much can I not do that, and how can I actually continue to set my goals to keep reducing my plastic waste. So it's a whole process, but I think if people just spend that time planning it out, if they have the bandwidth or the capacity to do that and the privilege to do that, they should do that, because there are options that exist to try to reduce some of these things.
Yeah, you're definitely right about that. I think that all of us collectively can agree that we have at least a few times or a few minutes during the day just to think about ways that we want to redesign our relationship with sorting out or like eliminating certain single-use products in our life, of course. And so I guess like this question's for Mackenna is like, why do you think there's just so limited options for zero waste currently, especially since we've seen kind of like a boom of like interest for the zero waste lifestyle movement these past few years? And so just wondering, like from obviously a consumer side yourself, is that like, why do you think there's not that many options available right now?
I mean, oh, that's such a big question. I'm not even sure. I'd have to think about it further, but I think it really does come down to like what's marketed and then what's convenient, like those two things combined. And what is marketed is a ton of plastic, unnecessary plastic, and very limited alternatives that maybe not everyone has access to or the ability to switch to. And I think that alone, it makes it difficult for more people, even more difficult to switch to those more eco-friendly options. And so it's super important to keep in mind. And again, like kind of what Kristy said with zero waste and just like slowing down, buying less, living more minimally, those are things that are very countercultural. And that is difficult, and kind of no one really wants to necessarily be like the weird person who's doing all these things that are just so abnormal in their social groups, you know. And so it takes a bit of courage and confidence to do something differently, like work towards zero waste, make lifestyle changes, stand up for these environmental issues. So it's a challenge, I think, in those regards as well. I do think, though, that as more people become aware of the issue, the more demand for, both individual change, what's actually sold, but then also what's allowed in like legislation and things like that. The more people care, the more action will happen. And so it's slow progress, but it is going that way. But it can be very difficult to get started in zero waste because it can be very daunting as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think from a market perspective, it's just that, marketing side of how it's been advertised and ingrained in our obviously daily livelihood since the day one, right? I've been exposed to plastics. And so I guess I'll circle this question back to Kristy, is that, you know, a lot of people sometimes are a little bit intimidated or just afraid of just like, you know, oh, I can't tackle the larger picture, but what individual things can I do? And so, you know, why do you, for people wanting to like learn more about zero waste, or like, you know, why should they want to live zero waste more, or like / a low waste lifestyle? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's about, for me, I think it's taught me to be more mindful. It's actually allowed me to have a lot more appreciation for the things that I own and why I own them and how I use them. So I feel like it's really like altered my perspective on my relationship to the objects in my life. Like I felt like I just like woke up and was just like, whoa, I never thought about what goes into this. I never thought about like how long this is going to last or when I'm going to toss it out. And in that way, the things that you own aren't just these things you own. It's actually a part of your identity in some ways, or like how you're living your life. And it's one of those things where I feel like zero waste, I just think that there's so many people who don't have the access and the privilege to live a zero waste lifestyle. And so they have to accept whatever the market's putting out. And so it's up to people who do have the privilege, the time, the money, and the resources to start shifting that conversation. And it needs to be distilled down to change the market, to be able to allow more people to have access to these resources. And so I think it's a collective, it's a part of creating this collective culture shift to living more sustainably as a society. And the burden shouldn't be placed on people who don't have the money or the means to do that. It should just be about how can we all reframe our relationship to the things we own, not blame or guilt trip people who don't have access to reduce their waste, and figure out how you address the system at the root on how these things are produced. How are companies being called out on this, and how are they shifting their practices so we're collectively addressing the plastic crisis together?
Yeah, that's a very beautiful way to say it. And I think that, you know, access and affordability is a lot of the conversations within zero waste and sustainability. And so I think that gradually, hopefully, you know, the demand increases, but also the cost decreases for these services, especially since not everyone has access to this. And so I guess, Mackenna, for you, is that, you know, someone that works a lot in ocean conservation and marine conservation, is that, you know, what are some of the best practices, the way that you have educated people, especially since, you know, a lot of the times not everyone lives in coastal communities, and I think sometimes it's often left out or / you know, not really talked about?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I think there are many ways that activism and spreading awareness can take shape. I think that there's a good place for different kinds of people and different ways of going about things. For me, in my personal experience, kind of my general code of conduct for myself, I guess, is like one, just make information as accessible and digestible as possible. I try to just be informed and read a lot and be up to date on information, but that's a lot of work to do, and not everyone has the time, ability, or desire to put in that much effort, understandably. And so I really try, both as an educator who's helping teach people about it, but also as someone who wants to learn more. I think it's really important to make it as accessible and easy to understand as possible for people, because once the information's out there, people do want to get involved. They feel compelled to, and so I think that's a really important part of it. And then two would be showing them firsthand if you can. Obviously, I'm in Hawaii. I can literally just drive like 20 minutes and show the plastic pollution at my local beach. So I'm very privileged in that sense to be able to do that firsthand. And social media is great for that as well, as a way to kind of take your environment and your situations and just blast it to an unlimited audience, which is wonderful. But that's especially why I love beach cleanups, for example. Beach cleanups by no means are going to be a solution for plastic pollution. It will not work. That is not the solution. But what is fantastic about beach cleanups is the sense of community that you can build and getting to show people firsthand. It's really cool. We get a bunch of local people and people that I know in my conservation community, but we'll also get a lot of tourists, which is like the best feeling in the world. It's like, thank you so much for like taking time out of your vacation to come like help us clean the beach. And it's a great way to show them firsthand, like, here is the issue. If there's this beautiful blue ocean and beautiful green mountains around you, and then plastic pollution. And it's a great way to kind of wake people up and truly see the issue for what it is. And then also, I think thirdly, that I kind of just like to go by just in general, is just always approach it with, again, like kind of what Kristy was saying earlier too, is like, don't guilt people, don't shame people, because we're literally all on a journey together, and like, no one's perfect, and our situations are different, and shaming anybody doesn't motivate them to do better. And so I always try to stick with it from a compassionate, empathetic lens, encouraging, inspiring perspective, to where it's okay wherever you are, you can help, and it's okay if you can't help in this area, but let's look how you can help in this area of your life, and that kind of thing, to where it shouldn't be some sort of exclusive club to get involved in environmentalism, and we can't afford it to be an exclusive club either. We need everyone to help where they can. And so that's kind of where I kind of shape my activism, for sure.
Yeah, and I really love that community education aspect, especially since I truly believe that, coming through a compassionate framework and just like understanding and meeting people where they're at, and just understanding like their own knowledge is obviously different from everyone's. And so just cultivating that relationship with the community in environmental education, it's so important. And so I guess, moving from like, the ocean and coastal communities, we haven't really talked much about urbanized communities. And so Isaac, according to Science Daily News, is that, there was a recent article or research posted that, we talked about pollinators' relationships and their behaviors and how they're moving up in different ecosystems. It was found that a lot of the bee populations in urbanized cities were using plastic to actually build their hives, which is something that, we haven't really seen in nature, of course, since plastic wasn't created back then. And so I guess like from your thoughts on that, like, can you just share us more about the importance of why we should be protecting these populations? And so not that they have to rely on plastics to build their own hives.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I hadn't really heard of that study in particular, but I had heard of a similar one out of Canada, where they found that alfalfa leafcutter bees in some situations were cutting plastic to build their nests instead of leaves, which it seems like it worked for them in that case. It's an interesting case of sort of nature recycling plastic to some extent. But that's definitely not the norm. I wouldn't say that pollinators are like recycling the world's plastic or anything. And it also, at least from that one study that I read, didn't seem like building the nest out of plastic had a severely detrimental effect on those specific pollinators. But yeah, pollinators are really important, and the greater plastic issue definitely affects them when it comes to things like climate change. And I think a lot of us intuitively know how important pollinators are, or at least know that they're like a foundational component of nature. And we see this just in their cultural ingrainment, right? We think about the Transformer bumblebee, or like Beyonce, or Batman. Bats are pollinators, or the musician Sting, or every kid growing up. Not every kid. If you're involved in music, you might learn Flight of the Bumblebee, or Muhammad Ali's famous saying, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. We just know that these things are very fundamental to the world that we live in. And from a more scientific and ecological perspective, that's because over 75% of our flowering plants are dependent on pollinators for their reproduction. So really, pollinators are essential for most of our flowering plants, which is how we get to all these different ecosystem services, like I mentioned briefly a little bit ago, that pollinators directly contribute to, right? Most of our nutrient cycles, food security, raw material production even, soil health and erosion control, wildlife resources, carbon sequestration, all of those types of things are dependent on pollinators. And of course, all those things also circle back to human health and well-being. And food security may be an obvious one, but even just outdoor recreation is dependent on pollinators. Sometimes maybe just for that aesthetic appeal, but also there's lots of erosion, like goodbye to a lot of your scenic hiking trails. And also with erosion, lots of communities are going to be adversely affected by that. If it affects the carbon cycle and a lot of carbon sequestration, that exacerbates the problem of climate change. So it is really important to human health and well-being. And even though it is such a multifaceted issue, right? It's definitely not just plastic. Everybody can actually help. And it might be by changing how you use or if you use plastic, but it can also just be the fact that everyone can provide some sort of pollinator forage, right? Everyone, even if you're living in the city like I am, and you just have like 1 square foot of space on a window box, you can help and provide habitat, or even just spreading the word or donating to organizations like ours, or really living an environmentally conscious lifestyle does make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree that too. It's just that, pollinators themselves are so key species, of course, in so many sectors of our environment. And I think that when we fail to obviously recognize and what they're also being exposed to, and just seeing the fact that these animals and species are being exposed and having to really redesign their own relationships to use their own plastic, it kind of scary, because then it makes you think like, well, what's going into my food if they're being exposed to this type of plastic? So everything like you mentioned, it translates back into what we eat. And so I guess, moving from that is this like everyone has collectively agreed is that, it's about individual change, of course, and not about perfection. And so Kristy, you kind of preach this in your own page and your work, is that choosing progress over perfection, right? And so many individuals, feel that, communities can often be shaming if you don't have a certain lifestyle or like being zero waste. And so how do you encourage people out there, those who are youth or elderly, they're trying to learn more environmentally conscious lifestyles, to really take small steps in their lives?
Yeah, I would just say to start with trying to eliminate plastic water bottles if you have access to a clean water tap. I feel like plastic water bottles are one of the biggest consumer things that just could be so avoided, especially if you have access to clean water. But if you don't, obviously I'm not talking to those people. So I would say that's a big thing. Try to eliminate things that are just multiple cases of something. Think about it. Could you make this? Instead of buying a smoothie in a bottle, you could make a smoothie. Instead of buying a bunch of plastic shampoo bottles or body wash, why don't you buy the bar instead? Those things are old fashioned and did exist before the whole realm of plastic, but they're still sold in department stores. And so I think those are some basic things. Do inventory on what plastic items you have and actually decide, hey, maybe I could explore some plastic-free options that are packaged, but they're maybe packaged in glass or paper, things that are much more readily recyclable compared to plastic. So I'd say that's a big change. Think about glass and paper products instead of plastic. Just go to the grocery store, go to wherever, and figure out how you can limit that. Because there are a lot of alternative options. Also, I would say that again, figuring out how you could reduce the amount of takeout you eat. So not only could that save you a bunch of money, it also reduces the carbon emissions of a delivery person. It also doesn't necessarily support a gig economy, which is a whole other thing. And it also reduces the amount of plastic waste that a lot of restaurants give out. And I'm not saying to not support local businesses. Again, that's contentious because of what's happening with COVID. We want to support local businesses, but also if you could just reduce the amount of takeout you're getting from 3 times a week to just once a week, and really doing an audit of how much plastic came from that one business. There's small things that you could just become more aware of and have conversations with your friends and family about. And I know in the Bay Area, I'm lucky because I have access to some restaurants that I know only do paper for takeout or do compostable, packaging. But that's not the case in most other places around the world. But I think even if you could call ahead in the future and be hey, just wondering what kind of packaging you're using. It may not mean anything to you and you may not actually change your options, but you can always choose better and see what else is out there. So those are my options for first steps. And I think that outside of that, those are the things I could see people actually making tangible changes and reducing the amount of money they're spending on just random things that they're just going to throw out after using once. So just think about that for future reference.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to know, is just like understanding where you can make those changes, and just like simply asking questions can sometimes give you the solutions. And, you know, for me, myself, you know, at Loop, like I love using plain products that, like, you know, so easy to really eliminate my plastic shampoo bottles and just use plain products. And so, you know, that was a really easy swap for me. And so I guess like the next question is like for you, Mackenna, is that, you know, our youth, you know, Gen Zers are usually, you know, the most, you know, powerful generation, especially like more, you know, than millennials. And so I guess like, how do you inspire the youth in your own community and your own page about addressing the plastic crisis through your work?
Yeah, again, another great question. I love my generation. We have a lot of not so great things, but we have a lot of power, and it's really, really cool, really inspiring. We have a lot of energy, and so it's really cool, really exciting. Kind of what Kristy was saying, another like kind of piggyback off of that, kind of asking questions about like your restaurants, like, hey, do you have like what's your packaging? What's really cool is that even if they don't have an alternative, they're still using plastic, you're already like making it clear that it's something that you're looking for, and so that's actually kind of a way to protest on a larger scale towards like, okay, like this is what I want, so like work towards that. The more customers kind of speak up into that. So yeah, like honestly, for any individual, but I mean, especially to my Gen Z family, is just to use your voice. It's so powerful. I mean, obviously, like when you look at the communities most impacted by climate change, it's going to be BIPOC communities and like obviously like animal species, but also as well is going to be the younger generations who are contributing to it probably the least compared to others, but will be around when a lot of the other generations aren't here. And so we'll have to deal with this problem more on the back end. We're kind of just getting started into it, honestly. And so I think it's just do what you can on the individual scale, speak up. Obviously reduce where you can. I think the main thing is that it's so easy to feel the weight of the world and like feel like you're solely responsible, and if you're not doing everything perfectly, then you're a failure and all this stuff. Don't let yourself get into that headspace. What's really great is that it's a community. You're not the only one doing it. Again, like there's a whole army of people fighting for environmental justice, plastic reduction, all this really great stuff. And so I would also recommend getting involved in your local community if you have one, or starting one. Or on social media. There's so many great ways to meet other people and feel inspired in that way. Just continue learning, continue growing with one another. That's really important. And then on my page, kind of for one of the previous questions, similar answer is just I try to just come at it with open arms. Anyone can get involved. There's no right or wrong way. It's just have the passion for it, be informed, do what you can, and then from there, like change is going to happen. It'll have to. So.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing that you mentioned is it's like it's not an I movement, right? It's a we movement. And so collectively we can all agree that, you know, we may be like, you know, in a sense different environmental sectors or fields, but collectively we all agree that we want to protect the planet and also really fight and showcase for future generations to have the same abilities and same opportunities that we did too, also growing up, and not have to really deal with this huge global environmental crisis of the plastic issues. And so I guess, you know, wrapping everything up, I guess I would love first to like thank everyone to really showcasing your own experiences and thoughts. And so I guess like for those that are wanting to learn more, I guess like we'll start with you, Isaac, is like where can people learn more? Are there like certain organizations that help you or like to help you become more educated about the plastic waste or slash, you know, the importance of pollinators?
Yeah, definitely. I think a great place to start would be to go to our website. That's just pollinator.org. There's loads of free information there, a lot of brochures. They're just completely free to print and download. Great eco-regional planting guides, no matter where you live in North America, basically. You can find a list of native plants that are appropriate for your eco-region. And then you can also always send me an email if you want more information, just isaac@pollinator.org. Or follow us on social media. The Pollinator Partnership is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And our communications coordinator does a great job of putting some great information out there and some specific programs that you can get involved with depending on what state you live in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we'll definitely be checking out. As Loop, we are big fans of the Pollinator org, and especially shout out to the San Francisco Bay Area, which we obviously love here. So love it. What about you, Mackenna and Kristy?
Oh, I'll go first, I guess. So you all can check out my work at www.browngirlgreen.org. I actually did an interview with Loop about a year ago around this time, which is kind of a whirlwind. So such a full circle. But you can check out the interview I did with Loop. It was a really great interview. You can also subscribe to the Brown Girl Green podcast on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. And then you can follow me on social media at Brown Girl Green on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you.
And then for me, you can find me at Kenna Aloha on Instagram. And then also an organization that I really recommend checking out is Break Free from Plastic. They did a really great documentary, The Story of Plastic. It focuses less on individual action, but also more of the greater picture. I cannot recommend it enough, so make sure to check it out.
Awesome. Yeah. And thank you so much again for everyone being able to attend and watch this series. Next week, we're going to be holding another circular conversation series, and this will be through the industry side. So as consumers ourselves or individuals, it was really great to hear each and everyone's perspective. And so next week, we'll be showcasing the business side and see how they're challenging the plastic issues from their own markets. Awesome. Thank you.